Joining me now is Cyrus Vance. He's the former Manhattan District Attorney. He spent a lot of time investigating the Trump Organization and brought charges against the company and its CFO. Also with us is Preet Bharara, the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. I cannot imagine two better people to talk to about what happened today. So, Cy, I want to start with you. Watching the trial today or hearing the reporting of it, what did you make of the legal arguments that were made by Trump's team?
Well, first, let me say it's a pleasure to be on this show with Preet Bharara, my colleague and U.S. attorney when I was in Manhattan. And it's great to have him here and someone I respect a great deal. With respect to today, I think the lawyers are just essentially beating their heads against a wall and hoping that the message somehow resonates either with the Court of Appeals, which I think is where they're looking for rescue, if anywhere, and in the court of public opinion to Trump's own supporters. But I think that in terms of moving their legal case forward or making any headway with the judge, I think it fell on deaf ears.
So, Preet, I know you've said before that the next step here could be the Court of Appeals, as your friend here just referred to. This is all about how much money Trump will have to pay. How do you think that the judge in the room would have heard those arguments today?
So let me also say it's an honor to be on your show, Jen, and also with my friend and colleague, Cyrus Vance, who I respect a great deal as well. I think you had it right in the opening that the lawyers here are relitigating things that have already been decided in what lawyers call a partial summary judgment motion, that, they're behind the eight ball in a very serious way, not only because the judge has found that there's liability with respect to one of the counts in the civil complaint, but also in doing so made certain findings and made certain statements in the opinion that make clear what this judge thinks of the credibility not only of Donald Trump, but of his lawyers. Repeatedly says that there were filings made and representations made to banks and to insurance companies that were fabrications, not just exaggerations. At one point, the judge says, in response to arguments being made about the valuations of these assets by Donald Trump and his team, that this is a fantasy world, not the real world. So whatever arguments are going to be made with a judge, to a judge who's already looking at the parties, Donald Trump himself and his lawyers, through a lens of lack of credibility. So I think it's an uphill battle for them.
In some sense, Jen, it's almost the same argument that the president is trying to make in defense of his criminal cases, which is, believe me, what I was thinking. I thought this was all okay. And with regard, as you mentioned, to his 10,000-foot apartment in Manhattan as opposed to the 30,000 feet that he claimed, or his valuation of Mar-a-Lago at however many hundreds of millions of dollars because it could be subdivided, while not acknowledging that, in fact, there was a restrictive deed when he got in there that he couldn't.
And you could do with a tape measure.
It's a fantasy world. And I would say that I think that with all the litigation that's going on, the walls are closing in around him. And however much bluster that he presents in the courtroom, I think he has to be concerned that his maneuvering room is really running out.
And the Attorney General and her team were obviously treating this like an actual case, right? Even if Trump's team was not. And Donald Bender, Trump's former accountant at Mazars, testified today. I know he's somebody that you have called before. Trump looked pretty uncomfortable during that moment. Why do you think it would be so upsetting? What would he have that would be upsetting to Trump?
Well, I wasn't in court today, but obviously Mr. Bender was an accountant who worked for the Trump Organization, and I think testified, if I'm correct, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that he felt he was misled and misled significantly. So Donald Bender, he'll be cross-examined on he's trying to cover his own mistakes. There'll be all those arguments. But those won't really, I think, have any sway with the judge. So as Preet, I think, said, we're done on that. It's maybe he's making a record for the Court of Appeals. But when your accountant or some professional that you worked with for decades and who has a very inside knowledge of your finances and how your business works, when that person basically says, I was lied to, that's relevant and important.
They literally have the receipts and then some, a lot of paper. One of the things, Preet, that was striking to me today was Trump's behavior. I'm sure it was striking to all of us. I mean, he stood outside of the courtroom repeatedly attacking the judge with extremely aggressive language. He said he should be disbarred, even charged criminally. It was crazy. I want to ask you, just to level set for everybody here, if he was any other defendant, what would happen?
Well, he might be sanctioned. This is going on in some of the other cases that are of a criminal nature, where there's a request for a limited gag order in one particular matter. He would, at a minimum, get admonished, and that may still happen here. It's a very unusual thing, and it's an odd trial strategy to sit there slumped in the courtroom as you described him, with a sort of dejected look on his face, and then with great fanfare go out to the cameras and attack the very judge who's presiding over your case, which to me, because Trump is not stupid, although some people think he is. He's not. That's to me a concession that they've already lost with this judge, and he's making a record, as has already been said a couple of times, for the Court of Appeals, but also the Court of Public Opinion, and a subset of the Court of Public Opinion, the people who are already on his side. You don't go out if you think you have a shot at being treated fairly or getting the result that you want and the outcome that you want. You don't go out there and talk about the jailing of the judge who's making that decision. And there's no jury here. He and his lawyers didn't ask for a jury. It might be different if he did that, but it's reprehensible behavior on his part. I don't think it will amount to much, certainly not in the courtroom.
This is just starting, this trial. I should be clear. Today was the very first day. A source close to Tish James has said that Trump would be called to testify closer to the end, which makes sense. Do you think, I'm going to start with you, Cy, he will testify? And you've been a prosecutor. What would you ask him? Well,
he's already taken the Fifth Amendment privilege in connection with earlier depositions in the case. So I think that gives you an indication of what he has thought up to now. I think he's also perfectly capable of saying he's going to do one thing and then deciding he's not.
We've seen that a few times.
And blaming the prosecutor and the judge as being biased, therefore forcing him again to take the Fifth Amendment. I'd like to hear what Preet says, but there's part of him that I'm sure wants to see if he can tell his story and bluster his way through. But I think there's another part, because he's a smart man, that realizes that he's not the Wizard of Oz. He can't value property at 500 times its value and have that be objectively reasonable in terms of the judge's analysis. So it would not surprise me if he says, I'm here, I'm going to testify, but he takes the Fifth at the end of the trial whenever he's called.
Preet, you heard your friend Cy Vance here. We want to know what you think. Do you think he says he's eager to testify? What do you think is going to happen?
He's not eager to testify. He's never eager to testify. He says he is. He did this multiple times during the Mueller investigation. He's done it during other matters and unfolding investigations as well. He's actually afraid of testifying. He knows what will happen to him in a court of law where he can't filibuster. It's not a bank of cameras and microphones outside a courthouse where he's dominant, or a rally of his in front of a bunch of supporters. Court of law is different. The other consequence, by the way, two other quick things. One, his problem is not that he exaggerates a little, right? The problem is that he lies and exaggerates by a lot. Even the judge in this case, in the summary judgment opinion, says, look, there's some concession that valuation of properties and assets is not necessarily a science, and you can be off by 20%, 30%, but not, as I said, by 500 times or 500%. He does that all the time. He does it in other parts of his life, too. The other consequence, by the way, for him not testifying, I don't think he will testify, is that I predict and expect that when the judge rules adversely to Trump, one of the bases on which he will do that is say, in a civil case, unlike a criminal case, he can draw an adverse inference against the party, against the defendant, Donald Trump in this case, because of his refusal to testify based on the Fifth Amendment. So it gives the judge an added ability and appropriateness to find against Donald Trump if he does not testify. So in this sense, Donald Trump is damned if he does, damned if he doesn't.